It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza, good morning.
Hello, Irwin.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Here we go. We've been really bouncing around east to west.
I was just thinking that. Yeah, it's great though. We have a good itinerary so far.
It really has been. When we are in, believe it or not, season 6. So, as a matter of fact, I wrote to Esperanza at the start of an episode one day, how, wow, we should call this Our Southampton. All of a sudden, we had all of these podcasts coming out of Southampton, and we've admitted in the past we sometimes seem to skew East Hampton town more, but
well, it is Our Hamptons.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, our farthest stray was, Riverhead, Calverton. I mean, that's
right.
That's kind of pushing it.
And we went to West Hampton Dunes with the mayor.
Well, that's still a Hampton.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's still a Hampton. So we're good there. We're good there. It's good. We're covering the terrain.
We are covering the terrain, exactly.
Maybe we should have said Our East End. That would have been better. But you know what? It wasn't as catchy.
No, it definitely wasn't as catchy. And that was part of it when we named this podcast back in the day.
But today it's Our Montauk.
It's Our Montauk. And yeah, I mean, it's terrific. And look, we've visited Montauk many a time. We've done the Seven Sisters and Leisure-Rama and the Montauk Shores condominiums. I mean, so we have been there. It's not as if we haven't, but this one, and really this comes right off of the Montauk Historical Society's website. We love Montauk Historical Society. Big shout out to Mia Sertic, the executive director. Terrific. This one happened to was really some articles written by Henry Osmers. I hope I'm getting that pronunciation right. Henry was, or maybe still is, the Montauk Point volunteer at the Montauk Point Lighthouse, and also he's written a couple of books, Esperanza. About
correct, yeah. I mean, a long time volunteer at the Montauk Point Lighthouse, and I've seen his books written about the lighthouse, I think specifically. And Montauk subjects, they're available on Amazon. So
exactly. So, but this was really and I thought it was really very clever about how it was termed. And he wrote this and entitled it Lost Montauk. Because, and again, there's a lot he starts this article really by saying how there are Montauk does have a lot of old and historic buildings. Esperanza, as an aside, it's interesting. Montauk, when you drive into it, almost seems like, for lack of a better term, newer. Like the town seems a little bit more, it seems like almost very nostalgic, almost 1960s, 70s kind of vibe. East Hampton, Southampton have this more historical perception. But Montauk's got an enormous history that sometimes, at least in my own head, doesn't really get recognized.
I think you're right. I think part of it might be, I don't know. We have to think about Montauk, and I think he used the word. Henry used the word in this piece, in this article, as a frontier. I mean, it was like a frontier village, a frontier settlement. It was like the place where they let out the sheep and the cattle. It wasn't like the place that it doesn't feel to me as much as the East Hampton Village, those settlements, Southampton, East Hampton, Southold, if you go to the North Fork, those were, I don't know, like little protected enclaves, whereas Montauk was like this big, wide open, barren terrain. It's like the prairie.
Yeah. And
out west,
And I think that could be part of it. I really do.
So there was like the opportunity to keep refreshing, it feels like the frontier,
I think that's
keeps it fresh.
I think it's a great point because, again, if you compare it, and we'll just go to East Hampton Village, you have all of these very old historical buildings really right in the center of the village. You could walk from one to the other. Montauk, though, is sort of like a sprawl. It's
It's a little more
sprawling.
scattered. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it is
And
a
you
little
can kind
different.
of see the different, I mean, not that this is not the case in other places, but sort of the different um uh phases of development that occurred from the 1700s through
Com-
today.
Completely true. Completely true. And again, some of these, a lot of these old historic buildings are obviously still there. The most obvious ones, the Montauk Point Lighthouse, the Montauk Manor, right in the middle of the village. I mean, so these are the visible reminders. But Henry writes, and I like this line, like other communities, some old and historic structures have been lost. And I guess this is where he came up with this whole concept of writing about Lost Montauk, which again, I love. And I think appropriately, he starts with the very aptly titled First House, which was the first house, was the first of three dwellings, three properties built in Montauk, and it was built in 1744, rebuilt in 1798, and
So it,
Esperanza. Yeah.
sorry, yeah. So first house was built clearly before the lighthouse because that was 1792. So,
Hmm.
it definitely predated. Yeah.
Predated that, predated this country becoming a
A
country.
country.
I mean, really, when you think about it,
Yeah, no, this was a colonial, not
you
even
know,
settlement, really. I mean, right?
exactly. But Esperanza, to your point about it, the sprawl and about the pasture and whatnot, the keeper who lived there was responsible, for the animals on the common pasture and to make sure certain that the fences were in good repair, the sheep that were grazing between first and second house, which were 4 miles apart.
Wow.
Wow.
Well,
Now that's and
at
again,
that time, you probably could see it in the distance, but on
I
a
would
good
think
day,
I would really think so. Yeah, not much screening back in that era,
right?
Esperanza.
Right.
I don't think, to your point, but
No, because I'm
but
thinking this, I mean, this was grasslands, right? I mean, that's why
yeah,
the cattle were, then the sheep were there. And I know that they were driven out east to Montauk, from Wainscott to Montauk even, and from east
that's
to
right.
Montauk, right?
Exactly, exactly. And Esperanza, right, again, but it's something. Boy, this is another recurring theme, and how it tells us here. The house also served as a hostel in a sense, and hostelry. And for travelers bound from Montauk during the 19th century, I liked Henry's description here about crossing the sandy, barren stretch of Napeague, where the mosquitoes would feast on the travelers, but they
That's
would
still the
reach.
case.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, right, boy? That's certainly true. Uh, but you reach the hills of Montauk, got a little breezier, and somehow the insects sort of disappeared.
Well, you got
That's
out of all that wetland. I mean, Napeague
yeah,
is the land washed over by the water, right?
that's
So
right.
yeah.
That's right. That's right. He talks about, gets a little bit more, involved about how there was a dark side of First House. Sometimes the family living there would be roused on a stormy night to see the survivors of a castaway crew. I mean, look, that was what this place was.
I mean, just imagine
Yeah.
you had three houses.
Yeah. And if right, and if
What is-
castaways are, they weren't going door to door here. If God forbid there was some sort of
It's like there
tragedy
might
like
be a
this.
glimmer of a light somewhere in the distance, and I see it, and I'm going there.
I mean, really, and it's
Oh gosh.
really, really something. And anyway, so generally it was accepted, questionably in a sense, that the first house was destroyed by fire in 1909. Apparently, wasn't a Long Island newspaper that covered this. The former East Hampton town historian Jeanette Edwards Rattray, East Hampton Star, in 1968 was told by a Benjamin Wells of Sag Harbor the first house was destroyed by a fire, but Mrs. Rattray was trying for 30 years to find out, and never really was able to confirm it. But making an assumption, okay.
It's probably a decent assumption, right?
I,
So
yeah, yeah. It makes sense to me. And and again, Henry Osmer concludes this about First House, about a man, William Bassett, who lived there from '03 to '06. And he was asked why he left in 1906. And he said, the sheep drove me off. I mean, transport yourself back. We always talk about this on Our Hamptons, Esperanza, transport yourself to a time and place. In 1906 Montauk, the sheep drove off the caretaker of First House. He got tired of the fencing. One foggy day, I went fishing. I had an 8-acre field of corn up 2.5 feet. I got home. The sheep got through the fence and ate it to the ground. I mean,
this
this is
is
Montauk, then.
yeah, it's what a what a life.
What a life. And
Interesting to think though also that at that time by that time, Arthur Benson had already purchased most of Montauk.
that's
So
right.
somehow this first house, second house, third house were excluded from his purchase. They definitely focused on the Montaukett lands.
Yeah,
So it's interesting. Just I mention it only because these settlements didn't affect. There was a coexistence. They didn't affect, as far as I know. The sort of cohabitation of two peoples.
agreed. And to use Arthur Benson as one, it also predated when Carl Fisher got there. So it was sort of like that in between time. He got there a little bit later, I believe, but
20s. Yeah.
there'll be more on Carl Fisher later. So now if we move a little onward to the Lathrop Brown estate, Esperanza's going to love this story because we have a Wainscott connection here.
Yes, I
It's
mean, who has heard of Lathrop Brown except for if you've done a little. I mean, if you do your history of politics, he was a U.S. representative,
That's right.
specifically actually for the first district, right?
That's right,
So it
which
was
is
this
our district on
area. He
Eastern Long
represented
Island.
our district.
That's
Hmm.
right. That's right. And quite a property. He had 30 acres, including 1,000 feet of waterfront, situated along the Old Point Road and very
This is just
close.
west of the lighthouse
That's correct.
on
That's
the
correct.
bluffs there.
And very close, and we're going to get to this later, but it does give me the opportunity to say it now. The Wyandanee Inn. We'll get
Yes, I
to that
can't wait
later.
to talk
Oh
about
my
that.
gosh. Right. We got to, I'm watching the clock on this because believe me, we're fitting that in. But to bring him into play here, uh, 30 acres, 1,000 feet of waterfront right on the cliffs. Really must have been a breathtaking estate.
Oh, it still is to this
Yeah.
day, this area.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the windswept, the very dramatic
Well,
Montauk,
yeah, today
the,
it's Camp Hero. I mean,
yeah.
it became that, right? We'll get
Right.
to that. Yeah.
Well, we will get into that. But in the spring of 22, he purchased a windmill in Wainscott. We spoke about this very early on in our Hamptons when we did a couple of episodes about Wainscott. Moved it to the property which he purchased from the Benson estate. Mill was built in 1812, the windmill. Moved to Wainscott in 1869.
From Southampton,
That's correct. That's correct.
where
So
it had already been moved, I think, a couple of times within
that's right.
Southampton.
That's right. I
It's
mean,
known as this windmill is known as the most moved windmill
uh,
on Long Island.
this windmill really got around.
It got around. Yeah.
This windmill was fast. It
Yes.
got around, right? It really did. But to your point about Camp Hero, Lathrop Brown and his wife showed generosity to the soldiers who served in World War One, annually having about a dozen of them spend a few weeks at the Windmill House with fishing trips. 1938, electricity was installed, and then power lines reached the Montauk Lighthouse, which, to touch on, itself was electrified by 1940. Now, there was the Great Hurricane. We've touched on this on many episodes of Our Hamptons podcast. September 38. There was devastation on the east end of Long Island. Lathrop Brown.
In particular, I mean, the old Montauk fishing village was
That's
just
right.
wiped out.
Leveled. But Lathrop Brown, apparently, he took everything seriously and secured his house, lashing up the windmill arms, and apparently little damage was said to have been caused by the storm. And to sort of wrap this up, by 42, and again, this, if you listen to we did two parts on the village, about Wainscott. This windmill was returned and placed on the property of the Georgia Association. You know, if you go on our Hamptons podcast website, Esperanza, I think there's a picture of you and I in front of that.
Yes, that's
If I'm
right.
not
That's
mistaken.
right. We did our little field trip to
Exactly.
windmill. Yeah.
You know, and new owner, George W. Pearson, professor at Yale University, definite Pearson name, very familiar out here as well as in New Haven, Connecticut.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that that was something, Lathrop Brown ran in the same circles as Pearson. Pearson had been, or rather, I think Lathrop Brown had been a roommate to FDR. I can't remember if it was at Groton, this
Right. The
school for
Coast,
boys,
Coast Guard.
or if
Yeah,
it was in university. But anyway, these people all knew each other for sure. And yeah, I mean, the windmill, which had originally stood on what was known as Mill Hill at the corner of Wainscott Hollow Road and
wow.
Wainscott Main Street,
Right.
on that southwest corner, or northwest corner rather, um, was returned to Wainscott by 1942, and there it
Wow.
is till to this day, a national, listed on the National Register. And
Exactly. And to your point, to wrap up about Lathrop Brown, the estate ultimately became a part of Camp Hero.
right, because the whole thing of it, basically, it was like his whole estate was decommissioned. I mean, it was like not decommissioned, but it was taken over by
Yeah.
the military, wasn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So it was a strategic site. So yes, Camp Hero.
Now, moving on this, really, and again, tremendous article by Henry Osmers. Thank you for it. We'll let him know about this, that we spoke of it. And again, thanks to Montauk Historical Society. The Montauk Island Club, or Deep Sea Club. Now, this is one of Carl Fisher's projects. And again, Esperanza and I continue to talk about this all the time. Carl Fisher could be a podcast in and of himself, which will at some point will come to be. But this opened in 1928 on Star Island, offering dinner, dancing. And again, put yourself in a place and time. You know, we're almost 100 years ago. Star Island, Montauk. It's the end of the earth now. What was it like in 1928 in terms of getting there and everything else?
It was
Dinner,
better than in
dancing.
the 1700s, I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
that's also true. That's also true. That's also true. Attracting, as Henry puts it in this article, an A-list crowd. And Esperanza, here's a theme that's going to has come into play on many an Our Hamptons podcast episode. It was also reported to be the most exclusive gambling resort in the East during its heyday, considered to be 28 to 36. Again, in the midst of a depression, but these A-listers didn't
And
seem to,
prohibition, obviously.
right? Didn't
Yes.
see, right. It was a speakeasy during the Prohibition era, and apparently, according to local legend, a notorious brothel.
Yes.
Who knows?
This area was so
I
seedy
mean, man,
back in the
man,
day,
what was,
right?
you know,
None of this happens anymore. No, I'm kidding.
um,
It,
I,
I think
or
it's
either they were or people that were just in the depths of losing a lot of their money were just
letting loose. Yeah.
drowning themselves in alcohol and other things. That cough wasn't a clearing the throat. It was I didn't know how to say the other things. But anyway, now the club, according to Henry, lost no time developing a sketchy history, suspicions of gambling. There were police raids. One raid, September of 29, $30,000 in gambling paraphernalia was confiscated. And I love this part. One raid the following year, it was said that the New York City mayor, Jimmy Walker, in attendance but escaped out through a window.
I don't doubt it. Of course.
This was
Yes.
look, we could go New York
History
City
repeats and repeats and repeats. Yes.
and Tammany Hall and all of what was New York City politics was like. But pushing forward to, much closer to present day, albeit 60 some odd years ago, It went through a couple of name changes over the years. It became the Deep Sea Club in 62, the Deep Sea Marina and Restaurant in 63. The 70s, it was the Deep Sea Yacht and Racket Club. A suspicious fire, however, and always a fire, Esperanza.
Mm.
Swept through the historic building in 89. Firefighters from really all over the East End, as far out way as Sag Harbor, came to fight the blaze. Arson was the cause. And so be it. That sort of ended, the history of that place. Plans will later announce that it would be raised condominiums, as far as I know. You know, I don't know what's there currently.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, this is back in 1990 that
Right.
the plans were rejected. So
Yeah.
who knows what's going on today? We need to
Yeah, well, that's
find out.
to delve deeper and to be continued. But then there was the Montauk Surf Club, another Carl Fisher extravaganza. And remember, he was thinking Miami Beach of the North during
Correct.
this time.
Hmm.
1930, the Montauk Surf Club, which would include a large Tom Thumb golf course, improved grounds and walks.
That sounds like an oxymoron. Large Tom Thumb.
I,
What is a
I,
Tom
I,
Thumb
I,
golf?
I have never, look, I'm not a golfer. I've never heard that term in relation to a golf, but a golf, how it relates to golf. But apparently Henry Osmers knows something I don't. But I don't know the answer to that. Again, it achieved success, but with the collapse of Fisher's fortunes by 32. And again, remember when we were here, the Depression, everything else, the club was sold to the Montauk Beach Development Corp, which planned to operate in conjunction with its Montauk Manor. Now, the Surf Club, according to Henry, over the next few years, it did enjoy significant success. Bathing beauty contests, water shows, but taken over in 43 by the U.S. Navy, which introduced night bathing. What that? What?
Night bathing.
Night
Ugh,
bathing?
what?
The U.S. Navy? Night bathing? Okay. I, okay. Anyway, the new Surf and Cabana Club was opened in 55, many aquatic events happening there. By the late 60s, reports of real estate developments in its vicinity. Here we go again.
More fire. More
More
fire.
fire. I'm gonna really see if we were really thinking ahead, Esperanza. We would have played some Jimi Hendrix. Let me stand next to
Well,
your
I'm thinking
fire
this
right
is
now.
leading into an episode. Maybe
Yeah,
we should focus on an episode of, arson or something.
Esperanza. That could be a future podcast. One word title: fire, because it seems to. Anyway, there was considerable damage, destroyed the front portion, offices, a dress shop. Here's a familiar Montauk name, Esperanza. The club's general manager, Frank Tuma Jr. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we know Frank Tuma. I don't know if it was junior, senior from Leisure-Rama.
Leisure-Rama. Mm-hmm.
You know, he said the club's pool had not been used for 3 years. Seemed as though the days for the surf club were numbered. Few months later, the Montauk Improvement Company announced plans to reconstruct it, but alas, it didn't materialize. And finally, in a move, and this happens frequently on the East End, became a place for the Montauk Fire Department to practice.
Yeah. I mean, I know it just makes me think of situations where they've done this, all over the place,
Right.
but out here in particular. And then I'm left thinking like, oh, come on, people, you could have preserved this.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right.
What is this? The boys have to go play with fire.
Right. And again, we do
I
understand. I
get
mean,
it. They need to
of
practice,
course,
but
firefighters do need to practice, and really, we can't thank them enough for all they do. But, it just makes you wonder, boys, some of these buildings, man, to let go like this. Again, Now, again, this article was written a couple of years ago, I believe, but the site is marked by a development named appropriately enough the Surf Club of Montauk, and there are some, I guess, properties built there. But to move on to Sandpiper Hill, now this was a magnificent estate built by Richard Webb for Walter and Mary McCaffrey, situated near the cliffs below Miller Avenue in Ditch Plains, 14-acre estate, considered at the time a showplace and one of a beloved place in part of Montauk, being Ditch Plains, commanding view of the ocean, center section with a big tall windmill, attractive according to the Montauk Chamber of Commerce, but far from functional. McCaffrey was a Wall Street broker, and with his wife, big supporters of the then Church of the Little Flower, now St. Teresa of Lisieux, I'm going to pronounce it, in Montauk. They contributed to that construction. They didn't live very long after getting here. McCaffrey died in 35, Mrs. McCaffrey in 40. Willed the estates to an Order of Society of Jesus based in Bronx, New York, said to be used to provide a home or retreat for ailing or retired Jesuits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it gets a little more familiar now, Esperanza, when it was resold to Sidney Reinstein, familiar name in Montauk, member of the New York Stock Exchange at the time, maintained the house till his death. I guess here's where the interesting part of this story for me came around was in 73, the photographer Peter Beard lived in Montauk, well-known photographer. He acquired the center section of this house, which included that 50-year-old windmill, moved it along to the old Montauk Highway west of the village, and here we go again. A fire. What
Yeah,
is it?
but wait, I mean, before
Okay,
you
yes,
go on
please, yes,
about the
please
fire,
go.
because the actual reason for moving this house was because it was hanging over the edge of the cliff, part of it,
Right. That's right.
literally
Thank you.
hanging over the edge of the cliff.
Uh, and
So,
maybe
okay,
not
so
literally,
Peter
maybe was
Beard,
actually hanging
no,
over the
no,
cliff.
literally,
Yeah.
like really. So then, yes, so Peter Beard moved it, and then lo and behold, 1977. So he moved it in 1973.
Right.
4 years later, destroyed by fire.
Unbelievable.
The
Unbelievable.
windmill portion.
That's correct.
And
And
so
now,
Beard lost a whole bunch of his papers. I mean, I remember reading about this already, because and also Peter Beard had a wonderful exhibition
right.
several years ago at Guildhall, and um, yeah, but what
Yeah.
a loss.
Moving on, and I think we're gonna push through this one a little quicker because we want to get to the Wyandanee Inn. But there was the Andrew Thomas, Elbert McGran Jackson State, bordered today by Flamingo, Tut Hill, and Fireplace Roads, right on Fort Pond Bay, overlooking the old fishing village, 13 acres, Moorish style in the 20s. You know, now Thomas was famous for designing apartment complexes within green areas, predominantly in New York. But this estate had greenhouses on it, tropical plants, fruit trees, ponds, a riding track, very much components. And we've, again, another theme here of a Gold Coast estate, Gold Coast being the North Shore of Nassau County, where so many of these houses sort of, I'm not going to say mirrored or copied, but were influenced by.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know,
Well, especially this whole idea of, exotic architecture. I mean, he was an
exactly.
architect, Andrew Thomas, and then at that time to do a house that was either a Mediterranean look, or
Right.
a French castle, as we've talked about with the recent decadence on Meadow Lane.
Right. And also, also the Devon colony with that stucco construction,
Exactly,
influenced by
exactly.
this.
Yeah. So here,
Influenced
Moorish.
by
Yeah,
this.
Moorish
Yeah.
and Montauk.
Moorish and Mont, that's a good one. Wow. I like that. I like that. Now, by 1960, buildings showed signs of neglect. Eventually, property was subdivided into 15 lots in 1988, but most of the estate remained open. But now, Esperanza, the Wyandanee Inn. Can I say that a few times? I just love the way that sounds, the Wyandanee Inn. Hilda Smith in 1915 opened the Wyandank Inn on the old Montauk Highway, about a mile from the lighthouse. And there's a book about this written by a Peg Winsky, Montauk, an anecdotal history.
This is her daughter who wrote the
Yeah,
book. Yes.
exactly.
Mary Smith Fullerton.
And at the time, Hilda told her husband, Noel Smith, if you want to sit in the Coast Guard station or at Ditch Plains and smoke your cigars, you can. But me, I'm going to open a business. And she did. And the inn thrived, becoming well known for Hilda's excellent chicken and shore dinners. Until
the recurring theme.
There's going to have to be a title change when we post
right,
this.
Right.
I don't
Fire
know.
That Lost Montauk.
But I got to tell you, when we make Instagram posts, Esperanza, I got a whole. There's going to be no lack of musical accompaniment to this.
I see you're inspired. Yes.
I no question about. There was a fire of unknown origin destroying the inn in November of 26, leaving nothing but the foundations, the stove, and the sink. But Hilda was determined to rebuild, and the Wyandanee Inn opened very near its former site. And given the remote setting of this inn, yet another ideal place for storage of illegal liquor during Prohibition. I can't.
I would love to travel back in time to the 20s. I really would.
I mean, this place, you want to talk the wild, wild West.
Yeah, it's the Wild East.
The Wild East.
It still is. Montauk is the Wild East. Yeah.
And again, the theme continues. During the Second World War, the property was taken by the Army to create Camp Hero. The Smiths had to leave.
Can you imagine that happening today?
Yeah, well, it's like, this whole...
It's kind of an eminent domain. Yes,
you hear about these crazy eminent domain stories. I just read a book about it. That's a side story about, somewhat near Groton in Connecticut, in New London, but that's a story for another day. So the property was taken over. Mary said the military installed showers in the inn for the men, buried all the bathtubs in the woods. And
I'd love to find those on Camp Hero. Let's go search.
Yeah, that's definitely an excavation for sure.
Metal detector would do it.
Yeah, and that marked the end of the Wyandanee Inn as an inn. And, the East Hampton Star reported on this. The first signs of this takeover were seen in advertisements in the Star. Secondhand furniture, reasonable, Wyandanee Inn.
When it was taken over by the Army.
That's right.
Yeah.
Contact Noel Smith with the phone number of Montauk 2405. Now, apparently the inn stood after the war, abandoned, graffiti, vandalism, and ultimately burned down as part of a drill.
Another drill.
By the fire department in Montauk in October of 67. Nothing, sadly, marks the site today along what was once a very active Montauk Highway and currently the entrance of the Camp Hero State Park. And Esperanza, I know time is running short, so we're going to try to wrap up with just quickly with this episode really do this in two parts, for goodness sake. But the Hither Plain Life-Saving Station, Coast Guard Station, established in 1849, and really should be noted, important point, resulted in the creation of a number of these stations along Long Island South Shore, 3 in Montauk.
Well, that was, the establishment of the life-saving service. That's why it was called the life-saving station, which we, today have many examples of these that have been preserved, including the one we all know well, at Amagansett.
Right, Atlantic Avenue, exactly. First keeper, familiar name, Esperanza, George H. Osborne, familiar Eastern Long Island name. appointed in December of 1872. A man of notoriously, as Henry puts it, intemperate habits, drunk on several occasions, always ready to drink with every Indian who might have a jug of rum. Finally removed from his post after 9 years in 81. Had a good run considering the behavior.
Correct. But it's a lonely existence out there.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Especially in the 1870s, it should be noted. Just running over some of these other keepers: Georgie Fleer.
Filer,
Pardon me. Thank you for
another
that.
local name.
Very
Parsons. Yep.
well-known local name. Thank you. I didn't have my reading glasses on. I apologize. During its time at Hither Plain, station was enlarged. Another familiar name, William D. Parsons, became keeper in 92, serving for 25 years. Interestingly, the Coast Guard wasn't formed until 1915, so Hither Plain became Station 66. And a watchtower during the First World War was added in 17. Hiram F. King, I'm assuming the Kings, another name well known out here, served for 3 years. And thereafter, Esperanza, apparently the position of keeper was ended, though the station was reactivated in 24 during Prohibition.
Right. It had been shut down in 22 and then started up, of course, to control the bootlegging.
Amazing. Amazing. What's going on here? And again, we spoke about this just recently on Meadow Lane, and, go whatever, 30, 40 miles to the east, and it's still going on. Prohibition ended in 33. The station was listed inactive soon later. Revived during World War II. The Parsons Inn, used as a barracks for servicemen. And to wrap this up, the station was abandoned in 48. The buildings razed shortly thereafter. No marker notes the existence of the station, just a grassy clearing overlooking the Atlantic Ocean.
Right. Well, fire or demo. I mean,
that was the really seemed to be the history. But Esperanza, that's really, thank you to Henry Osmers. What a fantastic,
great.
History of really an interesting topic, the Lost Montauk. So we really want to thank him, and I know we really need to wrap up. So to thank him, thank the Montauk Historical Society for really a fantastic post on their website, and thank you, Esperanza, for sharing this journey, one of 70 some odd at this point on our Hamptons podcast. Incredible.
Yeah, and it continues. And I think, we've done Lost Montauk. We'll do the existing Montauk and some of the gems that still exist to this day.
Save that thought.
All right.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Irwin.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.